Hey guys, tonight we're going to step back in time, not to the epic battles or the grand conspiracies, but to something much more intimate and, frankly, a little weird: medieval weddings. Imagine for a moment that you are a young noble, perhaps a girl of 14 or a boy of 17. The air is heavy with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. You're not thinking about finding your soulmate, you're thinking about the political alliance your marriage will forge, the land it will acquire, the debts it will settle. Your marriage isn't about you at all, it's a transaction, a merger of assets and power. You probably won't survive this journey with your modern romantic notions intact. But that's okay. We're here to let the past wash over us. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. I love to see just how far this sleepy little corner of the internet reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, or rather, your story, begins not with a tearful proposal or a nervous walk down the aisle, but with a piece of parchment and a negotiation. In the Middle Ages, love was, for the most part, a side effect, not a prerequisite. Marriages among the nobility and gentry were meticulously arranged. Often when the bride and groom were still children, it was a business deal, pure and simple. A father would secure a good match for his daughter to increase his family's land, wealth, and influence. A mother would use her connections to find a suitable partner who could elevate their social standing. You, as a young person in this era, had very little say in the matter. Your feelings were irrelevant. The future of your family line, your security, and the stability of your entire social network depended on this arrangement. You might meet your future spouse for the first time on your wedding day. A total stranger whose face you can barely make out in the flickering candlelight of the feasting hall. Historians still argue whether the concept of romantic love, as we understand it today, even existed in the medieval mindset. Some scholars believe that the troubadour tradition of courtly love was a purely performative, almost game-like activity, completely divorced from the practicalities of marriage. Others suggest that while arranged marriages were the norm, affection and even genuine love could and often did grow between the partners over time. The idea was that marriage was the fertile ground, and love was the unexpected, beautiful flower that might or might not bloom within it. A key historical fact is that in this period, the primary purpose of marriage was the continuation of the family line and the consolidation of property. The church, while pushing for a more spiritual union, largely accepted this reality, as long as the vows were made with a modicum of consent. This led to a fascinating, quirky tidbit. Sometimes, a couple would be betrothed but not married for years, with the agreement sealed by a simple verbal contract and the transfer of a token, like a ring. This early step, the betrothal, was almost as binding as the full wedding ceremony in the eyes of the law. Even if it lacked the pomp and circumstance, the negotiations were brutal and long. They'd involve dowries, a transfer of wealth from the bride's family to the groom's, and dower rights, the portion of the husband's property that a widow could claim. It was all about the numbers, the acreage, the herds of sheep, the strategic location of a castle. Yeah, you might sit there, a silent observer, as your future was charted out on a ledger. You're a pawn in a much bigger game, but the game, as you'll see, has some fascinating and, frankly, very strange rules. So, as the last bit of light fades from the sky, let's leave our modern sensibilities behind and sink into this world where happily ever after was a good harvest and a strong alliance. As you drift deeper into the past, the initial negotiation for your marriage has concluded. The land deeds have been signed, the dowry amount agreed upon. Now comes the first public step toward your new life, and it's a bit of a low-key affair by modern standards. But it's legally binding. It's called hand-fasting or betrothal. You stand before a priest, or perhaps just a few close witnesses, and you hold hands with your future spouse. You might not even know their name yet, but their hand is warm and a little clammy in yours. This isn't the big wedding day, this is the engagement, but it's far more serious than a modern promise. The word itself, hand-fasting, literally means to make a bond with the hand. It's a physical sign of an unbreakable vow. This simple act, often done with no more than a few spoken words and the exchange of a ring, was legally considered a valid marriage in the eyes of the church up until the 16th century. Historians still argue whether this was a true trial marriage, where a couple could live together for a year and a day before deciding to make it permanent. Most scholars now believe this was a much rarer, more localized custom, and the main function of handfasting was simply to formalize the engagement. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is that you could be betrothed to someone without ever having met them. Sometimes, a stand-in would hold the hand of the bride on behalf of the absent groom. Imagine a total stranger shaking your hand and promising you to someone you've never seen. It's like a medieval proxy betrothal service, a very early form of online dating. But without the profile pictures or the ability to swipe left, you're just stuck. The betrothal was a public promise, and breaking it was a serious breach of contract, with both legal and social consequences. You might have to pay a hefty fine or lose a significant portion of your dowry. It was a lock on a much bigger deal. For the common folk, this was often the only ceremony they had, a quick, simple exchange of vows and a handshake, perhaps witnessed by a few neighbours, and you were considered married. There were no white dresses, no elaborate feasts, just two people starting a life together with a verbal agreement. A mainstream historical fact is that the Council of Trent, a major meeting of Catholic leaders in the 1500s, officially clamped down on this practice, requiring all marriages to be performed in a church before a priest and at least two witnesses to be considered valid. This was a direct response to the clandestine or secret marriages that were becoming a social problem, allowing people to renege on their vows. Your hand is still being held. The ring, perhaps a simple iron band, feels cool against your skin. You've just made a promise that you cannot take back. A promise that has nothing to do with how you feel about the person beside you. It's a pragmatic, no-nonsense start to a life together. You can't help but wonder what this person is really like. Are they kind, cruel? Will they be a good partner in this new life you are about to build? The uncertainty is a heavy blanket, but there's a certain inevitability to it. It's a very different type of pressure from the modern "will you say yes" question. There is no question. The answer was decided long ago, by people who have never had to share a bed with the person they've chosen for you. A funny thought flickers through your mind. You're already married, in a way, just with a much less dramatic lead-up. It's like the pre-game show for the main event, but the pre-game show is actually the thing that matters most. Legally speaking, this initial step is a quiet, legal whisper before the very loud, very public shout of the actual wedding day. Your hand is released, the betrothal is sealed, and now you must wait. The days bleed into weeks, the weeks into months, and the anticipation, a strange blend of dread and curiosity, grows. Finally, the day arrives. You're awoken before dawn by the bustling sounds of servants. Today, you will be married. The whole household is in a flurry, preparing for the procession that will wind its way to the church. This morning is a hive of activity, a sensory overload that's meant to overwhelm you and carry you along on a wave of ceremony. The dawn of your wedding day is not a quiet, private moment. It's a public spectacle from the very beginning. You are not just a bride, you are a moving piece of a larger, living tableau. You sit still as women fuss with your hair and clothing, the rustle of fine linen and the scent of lavender and herbs filling the air. Your clothes are likely new, perhaps even tailored for this very occasion. A rare luxury for many, for a noble bride. This is a chance to display the wealth and status of her family, a final, beautiful showing of her father's resources before she becomes an asset of her husband's family. A key historical fact is that the colour white was not the traditional colour for a wedding dress. In fact, brides wore their best dress, which could be any colour, often rich reds, blues, or purples. White became popular centuries later, linked to Queen Victoria's own choice of dress. As you are dressed, you can hear the sounds from outside, the clatter of horses' hooves, the excited chatter of villagers, and the hopeful notes of a lute or pipe. This is the wedding procession, a crucial part of the ceremony, not just for travel but for public display. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is that the procession was often deliberately long and winding, designed to be seen by as many people as possible. It was a parade of social standing. The order of the procession was strictly hierarchical, with the most important guests at the front. You, the bride, would be at the head of the procession, perhaps on a horse or in a litter, surrounded by your family and attendants. The groom's party would often come out to meet you part way, a symbolic joining of the two families before they reached the church. It's a bit like a medieval red carpet event, except the carpet is mud and the paparazzi are just your neighbours. The atmosphere is a mix of solemnity and unrestrained joy. You can feel the weight of your family's expectations on your shoulders, but you can also hear the laughter and well wishes from the crowd. Everyone is watching, and everyone knows what is happening. This is not a private ceremony. The collective presence of the community is vital. Their witnessing of the union makes it real and legally binding in the public eye. Historians still argue whether the level of public participation was purely ceremonial, or if it was a deep-seated tradition to ensure the marriage was seen as legitimate by all, preventing future disputes. The belief was that if a marriage was performed in public, it was harder to deny later on. You feel the cool breeze on your face as you step out, and the sun, still low in the sky, warms your skin. You are walking toward a new life, a new name, and a new family, all under the gaze of a whole community. The noise of the procession, the shouts of well-wishers, and the simple melody of the music are a sort of sensory cocoon, muffling your private thoughts and fears. There's a strange comfort in it, being carried along by the momentum of a very old tradition. This walk is the final journey of your old life and the first step of your new one. You don't have to do anything but walk, and for a moment, that feels like a relief. The procession is a slow, rhythmic journey. You are surrounded by the sights and sounds of the village, but your focus is fixed on the imposing silhouette of the church ahead. The air is cool, and the sounds of the crowd are a low, continuous hum. The scent of the fields and the fresh morning dew mix with the faint, sweet smell of the flowers in your hair. This walk is the final act of a long play, but it's the church that holds the power to make it all official. For centuries, marriage was a secular affair, a contract between two families. But a mainstream historical fact is that by the High Middle Ages, the Church had successfully asserted its authority over marriage, transforming it from a mere social contract into a sacred sacrament. As you step across the threshold, the stone walls feel cool and solid. The dim light inside is broken only by the narrow beams filtering through the stained glass windows, and the air smells of old stone and incense. The marriage ceremony itself, by modern standards, is surprisingly short. You are not walking down an aisle lined with flowers, you are likely standing just inside the church doors, in the porch or at the entrance. This quirky tidbit highlights a key difference. The marriage was a public sacrament, but it was not always performed within the holiest parts of the church. The main body of the church was reserved for the sacred Mass and communion. It was a clear delineation between the worldly and the divine. The priest, a stern-looking man with a simple robe, speaks in a calm, authoritative voice. But you are barely listening. Your mind is a jumble of thoughts and emotions, a whirlwind of anticipation, apprehension, and a strange sense of unreality. The priest performs a simple blessing, and you and your betrothed repeat your vows. These vows are not the personalized, heartfelt promises we know today. They are a formulaic, legally binding set of words. He pronounces you man and wife, and the ceremony is over. It's that simple. There are no long readings, no emotional speeches, and no elaborate exchange of rings. The vows are a contract, and the priest is the public notary, solidifying the agreement in the eyes of God and the community. Historians still argue whether the Church's true motivation was spiritual purity or simply a desire to exert control over the lives of its flock. The Church's power was immense, and by making marriage a sacrament, it was able to enforce its own rules about who could marry whom, when, and under what circumstances. It outlawed marrying relatives, even distant ones, a rule that created a convenient way for the Church to grant annulments for political reasons later. It was a clever piece of legal and social engineering. As you stand there, a new couple, you can feel the quiet, collective approval of the witnesses. Your new status is not something to be taken lightly. It is a sacred bond, one that is not easily broken. You can feel a small sense of relief as the priest gives you a final blessing. The weight of the moment is heavy, but the weight of the endless negotiations and the long wait is finally lifted. The service is over, but the day is just beginning. The short, solemn ritual in the church is just the prelude to the real celebration. which is about to begin. It's almost comical in its brevity. A whisper of a ceremony followed by what will be a thunderous party. You turn to look at your new spouse, a stranger you are now bound to forever, and you wonder what the rest of the day and the rest of your life will bring. The church doors are open, and a different kind of world, a world of feasting, music, and raucous celebration, is waiting just outside. Now that the solemn part is over, your new life begins in earnest, and in medieval times, that often meant a rather significant transfer of assets. The moment you step out of the church, the atmosphere shifts from piety to practicality. We're talking about the dowry and the dower. This is where the business part of the marriage truly comes to life. Your father has promised a specific amount of wealth, land, or goods as your dowry, and now it's time for the payment. This is a mainstream historical fact. The dowry was not just a gift, it was your share of your father's estate, a way to ensure you had some financial security in your new life. None, it was your portable inheritance, a tangible asset that you were bringing to your new family. It was what gave you value and leverage. The dowry could be anything from a large sum of money to livestock, fields, or even furniture. You can imagine a caravan of carts arriving at your new home, laden with your future. This is your stuff, your property, and it is meant to provide for you and your future children. It's a very different mindset from the modern wedding registry, where guests buy you a blender. In this world, you are bringing the blender, the kitchen, and probably the whole house. A quirky tidbit is that for the wealthy, the dowry often included a marriage chest or coffer, beautifully carved and filled with linens, clothes, and other household goods. It was a physical representation of the wealth you were bringing to the marriage, and it was a point of pride for your family, a bit like a medieval brag box. But the deal wasn't entirely one-sided. In return for the dowry, your new husband would have to provide a dower. The dower was a portion of his property that was legally set aside for you, the wife, in case he died. It was your protection, your safety net. This portion of land or income was your widow's allowance, ensuring that you wouldn't be left destitute if something happened to him. Historians still argue whether the dower was a true measure of a woman's worth or simply a legal mechanism to prevent her from becoming a burden on the state or on her own family. It was a legal handshake, a guarantee that while you were bringing wealth into the marriage, you would also be provided for in the event of tragedy. You might not have been able to choose your husband, but you could, in a way, choose your future security. The dower was often a third of his lands, though it could be more or less depending on the negotiations. This was a critical point in the marriage contract, and a family might walk away from a deal if the dower wasn't seen as sufficient. You can almost feel the tension in the air as the two families, now one, review the final documents. There's a subtle but palpable sense of relief when the terms are met. Your future is now secured on paper, a contract of property and provision. As you watch the scribes roll up the parchment and seal it with wax, you realize that your love story isn't written in sonnets, but in legal clauses, and for the Middle Ages. That was a truly romantic gesture. It was about stability, security, and survival. It was a promise. But it was a promise backed by land, livestock, and a whole lot of very serious legal talk. With the legal and financial matters settled, the focus shifts to something a little more visible, the clothes. You stand there, a freshly minted wife, but you're not wearing a shimmering gown of white satin. A mainstream historical fact is that bridal attire in the Middle Ages was less about a specific style and more about displaying wealth. The goal was to show off your family's status, so you would wear the finest garments you owned, which could be any colour, often rich reds, deep blues, or even black. The more luxurious the fabric, velvet, silk, and brocade, and the more intricate the embroidery, the better. It was a walking, talking resume of your family's prosperity. This wasn't just about showing off. It was dictated by strict social codes. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws. These were statutes passed by governments to regulate what people could wear based on their social class and wealth. A quirky tidbit is that these laws were incredibly detailed, specifying everything from the type of fur a person could wear to the number of buttons on their clothing. For instance, A commoner might be forbidden from wearing silk, while a knight was allowed to wear a certain color or a specific type of fabric that was off-limits to everyone else. The laws were an attempt to maintain a clear social hierarchy and prevent the lower classes from dressing above their station. So, your wedding dress, while beautiful, was a visual contract, a reflection of your place in the world. You might feel the heavy weight of the fabric and the intricate embroidery, a physical representation of the wealth you are now expected to maintain and pass on. The dress itself is a silent promise, a vow made in linen and velvet, saying, "My family is important." For the common folk, the wedding attire was much simpler, often just their best clothes, perhaps a simple woolen tunic and a clean linen shirt. There were no grand displays, no fancy silks. Their status was fixed, and their clothes reflected that reality. The ceremony was about the union, not the show. Historians still argue whether these laws were truly effective or if they were often flouted by those who could afford to pay the fines. It's likely that they were more of a guideline than an absolute rule, but their existence shows a deep-seated anxiety about social order and the fear that if everyone dressed the same, the lines between classes would blur. And what's more chaotic than blurred class lines? Nothing. In a medieval mindset, you can almost hear the whispered gossip as people in the procession eye your clothing, assessing its value and silently judging your family's worth. The dress is more than a garment. It's a public statement, a very expensive one. The entire day is a performance, and your clothes are your costume. It's like a medieval fashion show. But instead of applause, you get the quiet nod of approval from your new family, which is worth more than any magazine cover. With the procession and the solemnities of the church behind you, the real fun begins, or, depending on your perspective, the real chaos. You are led from the church to the feast, a sprawling affair that is the heart of the wedding celebration. This is not a quiet dinner, it's a boisterous, often rowdy, party meant to be seen and heard by the entire community. A mainstream historical fact is that these feasts were a crucial display of a family's wealth and generosity. The more food, the more wine, and the more guests, the higher the family's social standing. This was their moment to shine, to show off their prosperity and their newfound alliance. The hall is a blur of activity. Long wooden tables are groaning under the weight of platters piled high with roasted meats, boar, venison, and fowl, alongside loaves of fresh bread, cheese, and vegetables from the garden. The air is thick with the aroma of roasting meat, mulled wine, and the earthy scent of straw on the floor. You might feel a little overwhelmed by it all. A small, quiet point in a sea of noise and colour. A quirky tidbit is that the food was often presented in elaborate, sculpted forms called subtleties. These could be anything from a roasted peacock reassembled in its feathers to a sugar sculpture of a castle or a mythical beast. They were as much a piece of art as they were food, meant to wow the guests and demonstrate the chef's skill and the family's wealth. It's like a medieval version of a reality cooking show, but with much higher stakes. The guests are a mix of close family and distant acquaintances, and everyone is there to eat, drink, and be merry. The atmosphere is loud, with constant chatter, laughter, and the clinking of pewter tankards. It can get a little unruly. Historians still argue whether the feasting was a true celebration of joy or a carefully orchestrated social ritual to solidify the new union. It was probably both. The feasting served a practical purpose. It was a chance for the two families to get to know each other, to see their new in-laws in a less formal setting. It was also a pressure release after the long, tense process of negotiation and ceremony. You might feel a sense of relief, watching people laugh and eat. The tension of the morning is gone, replaced by a feeling of shared celebration. Your role is simple. You sit at the high table with your new husband. You accept congratulations, and you try to eat something while everyone watches you. There's a playful, gentle sarcasm in the air, with guests making jokes and singing ribald songs. The feasting hall is a place of community and connection, a physical space where your two families begin to truly blend. It's a messy, loud, and beautiful demonstration of a new beginning. But as you watch the guests getting a little tipsy and the plates being cleared, you can't help but wonder what comes next. The party is a lot, but it's not the end. It's just the start of the rest of your new, very public life. The feasting hall hums with the energy of 100 conversations. But one particular sound starts to rise above the others, a clinking of tankards and a call to buy a drink. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky and rather practical tradition, the bride ale. A mainstream historical fact is that this wasn't just a party, it was a business venture. The word bridal itself, as in a bridal shower, is derived from bride ale. The ale was home brewed by the bride and her family, and it was sold to the guests at the wedding feast. You can imagine yourself, a young bride, sitting at the high table as a line forms, people waiting to buy a cup of your family's brew. It's a way for the couple to start their new life with a little bit of cash, in a world with no bank accounts and very little credit. This was a simple, effective way to get some startup money for the new household. It's like a medieval GoFundMe, but instead of a website, you have a barrel of homemade beer. A quirky tidbit is that the quality of the ale was a point of pride. A good brew not only brought in more money, but also earned the family a good reputation. If your ale was weak, watery, or tasted of old socks, it was a source of great shame. So you're not just a bride, you're also a brewer and a businesswoman, all in one. The bride ale wasn't just a simple transaction, it was a deeply social ritual. Guests would buy a cup and then drink a toast to the new couple, offering their well wishes and a small contribution to their future. Historians still argue whether this tradition was a form of formalized begging or a genuine community effort to support a new family. It was probably a little of both. It was a way for those who were not wealthy enough to give a substantial gift to still show their support and participation in the wedding. It also helped ease the financial burden of throwing a massive feast, which, as we've seen, was a crucial display of status. The money from the bride ale could be used to buy a new plough, a cow, or some much-needed household goods. You can feel a small sense of pride as you watch the coins drop into the wooden bowl. This isn't just about money, it's about a new beginning, a collective investment in your future. The laughter and chatter around you feel warmer, more personal. Everyone here, from the noble lord to the humble peasant, is contributing to your new life. It's a reminder that a medieval wedding was about more than just two people. It was about the entire community coming together to witness, support, and celebrate a new union. And you, the bride, are at the center of it all, with a cup of very practical, very profitable ale in your hand. The ale is flowing, the food is being devoured, and the hall is alive with noise. But a feast without entertainment is just a very big meal. Now, you find your senses captured by a different kind of performance. In the corner of your eye, you see a flash of color, a glint of metal, and the rhythmic beat of a drum. We are talking about the entertainers, the jesters, jugglers, and musicians who were a vital part of any large medieval gathering, and especially a wedding. A mainstream historical fact is that noble households often had their own resident jesters and minstrels, but for special occasions, they would hire additional performers to truly impress their guests. The music fills the air, the reedy sound of a pipe, the simple strum of a lute, and the lively beat of a small drum. The songs are not the polite ballads of modern times. They are likely lively dance tunes or bawdy ballads that elicit laughter and cheers from the crowd. You watch a minstrel, his voice clear and strong, singing a story of a hero or a lover. His performance is a narrative anchor, giving a sense of shared culture and history to the event. A quirky tidbit is that these musicians, or minstrels, were often travelling performers, moving from one castle to another, and they were the primary source of news, gossip, and new songs. They were the medieval equivalent of the internet, but with better hats and a lot more rhyming. They brought the outside world into the closed circle of the noble's castle. Then there are the jugglers. You see a man with a sly grin. His hands are blur as he keeps 3 or 4 colourful balls in the air. He might even throw in a few daggers or flaming torches for a gasp-inducing spectacle. His movements are graceful, his timing impeccable. And the jesters, the jesters, they are the comic relief, the social commentators, and the fools who are wise enough to be able to speak the truth without consequence. They might make jokes at the expense of the new couple or the prominent guests, and everyone is expected to laugh. It's their role to break the tension and to remind everyone that despite the serious nature of the marriage, life is meant to be enjoyed. Historians still argue whether the jesters were a symbol of the inversion of the social order for a day, a temporary release valve for the pressures of hierarchy, or if they were a carefully controlled instrument of the court, saying what the Lord wanted to be said in a palatable, humorous way. It's likely a bit of both. They were both a mirror held up to society and a tool of power. As you watch a jester chase a chicken around the feasting hall, a light chuckle escapes you. It's a surreal sight. This mixture of high-stakes politics and lowbrow entertainment. You are a new wife in a new family, but for this moment, you are just a girl watching a funny man make a fool of himself. It's a moment of pure, unadulterated escapism in a day that has been so heavily laden with expectation and ceremony. The noise, the music, the laughter, it all serves to make the day feel like a true celebration, a shared experience for everyone. The feasting hall has grown quiet. The last of the food and ale consumed. The laughter and music have faded. And the air is now thick with the scent of beeswax candles and a palpable sense of anticipation. This is it, the end of the party, and the beginning of the most private, so yet surprisingly public part of the wedding, the bedding ceremony. A mainstream historical fact is that in the Middle Ages, the consummation of a marriage was not a private affair, it was a public ritual, witnessed by family and friends, to prove that the marriage was valid and legally complete. It was about creating an heir, not just a union. You and your new husband are led, not by a single person, but by a joyous, rowdy procession of guests. The men accompany the groom and the women accompany the bride, singing bawdy songs and making lewd jokes. You might feel a blush rise to your cheeks, but there is no escaping it. This is a crucial part of the process. It's an affirmation from the community that this marriage is happening, that you are entering a new phase of your life, and that the promise of children and a new family line is now in motion. A quirky tidbit is that the process often involved throwing the bride's garter, or sometimes even her shoes, for good luck. The guests would then scramble to catch them, hoping to be the next to marry. It's like a medieval version of a bouquet toss, but with a bit more of a frantic, almost chaotic energy. When you reach the bedchamber, the guests don't leave. They stay and help you both undress, offering playful commentary and encouragement. This is not about romance. It's about a very practical, very public confirmation. The guests might even tuck you into bed, and a priest might say a final blessing over the bed itself to ensure a fruitful union. Historians still argue whether this was a form of social control, a way to ensure that marriages were truly consummated, or a genuine desire to bless the union with communal good wishes. It was likely both, a blend of practicality and superstition. The public nature of the ceremony was a powerful tool to ensure the legality of the marriage and to provide witnesses in case the marriage was later challenged. Once you are finally alone, the door is closed, and a new life begins. The boisterous noise outside fades into a gentle hum, and you are left in the quiet, flickering light of a single candle. The bedding ceremony is over, but its purpose, to legally and socially confirm the marriage, is complete. It's a surreal moment, a jarring transition from the public chaos to a private quiet. You are no longer just a daughter or a young woman, you are a wife. And as you lie there, you realize that your love story, far from being a private affair, has been a very public performance from beginning to end. And that, in a strange way, is the most romantic thing of all, a whole community coming together to witness and celebrate your new life, as the noisy procession of well-wishers fades into the night, leaving you and your new spouse to the quiet solitude of your bedchamber. You can't help but reflect on the sheer spectacle of it all, the elaborate feasts, the loud music, the public rituals. It was a world away from the lives of most people. We've been focusing on the noble and wealthy, but what was a wedding like for the vast majority of the population? This section is about the love and marriage among the peasantry. A mainstream historical fact is that for common folk, marriage was far less about political alliance and much more about practicality and survival. It was a union of two workers, a way to combine labour and resources to make a living. There were no elaborate feasts that lasted for days, no intricate sumptuary laws to dictate what you could wear, and no public bedding ceremonies with a priest. A peasant wedding was a much simpler affair, often performed on a feast day or a Sunday after Mass. It was a practical arrangement. A boy and a girl would agree to marry, perhaps with the permission of their parents or the lord of the manor, and then they would announce their intentions to the priest. This announcement, known as the banns, was a crucial part of the process, ensuring that there were no legal impediments to the marriage. A quirky tidbit is that the wedding itself often took place at the church door, just as it did for the wealthy, but without the pomp and circumstance. The couple would exchange simple vows, perhaps with a plain ring or a token, and then they were married. The reception, if you could call it that, was a very different affair. It was often a simple meal shared with family and a few close neighbours. The bride ale tradition, which we discussed earlier, was a vital part of a peasant wedding. It was a way to raise a small sum of money to start their new household, to buy a plough or a cow, or simply to have a cushion of coin for a lean year. It was a communal investment in the future of the new couple. It was a very pragmatic way of getting a start in life. Historians still argue whether the simplicity of a peasant wedding was a sign of a more pure love, free from the constraints of wealth and politics, or if it was simply a reflection of their limited resources and the harsh realities of their lives. It was probably a little of both. They married for love, yes, but it was a love rooted in the daily struggle for survival, a partnership to face the world together. For the peasant, a wedding was not a spectacle, it was a new beginning, a new household, a new unit of labour for the community. You can almost feel the calloused hands of the young couple as they join together, the simplicity of their vows, the quiet celebration, and the practical gifts of a new plough or a sack of grain all speak to a different kind of love, one that is less about power and more about shared struggle and hope. It's a very different picture from the gilded cages of the nobility, and in its own way, it's far more romantic. The journey into medieval marriage has been a mix of spectacle, practicality, and solemnity. But what happens when the solemn vows, whether said in a grand church or a simple field, begin to sour? For a modern person, the answer is often divorce. But for you, in the Middle Ages, that word has a very different meaning. A mainstream historical fact is that there was no such thing as a divorce in the modern sense. You couldn't just decide you weren't happy and go your separate ways. Marriage, as a sacrament, was considered an unbreakable bond in the eyes of the Church, a bond that could only be broken by death. But, as with all things, people found a way. The closest thing to a divorce was an annulment. An annulment wasn't a dissolution of a valid marriage. It was a declaration that the marriage was never valid in the first place. It was a legal loophole, and a very difficult one to exploit. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is that the grounds for annulment were often quite obscure. You could claim that you were too closely related by blood to your spouse, even if the relationship was extremely distant and you had no idea. That one of you was spiritually related, for instance, if one of you was the godparent of the other's child, or even that the marriage was never physically consummated. This last one was a particularly tricky and embarrassing thing to prove, as it sometimes required a public examination. It's like a medieval game show where the prize is not having to be married to a specific person anymore. But the challenges are incredibly humiliating. The process for an annulment was lengthy, expensive, and often politically motivated. It wasn't something a peasant could afford. It was a tool for the wealthy and the powerful, kings and queens. In particular, used annulments to get out of politically inconvenient marriages and to secure alliances with other kingdoms. For example, King Louis XII of France annulled his marriage to Joan of France on the grounds that he hadn't been able to consummate the marriage due to a bodily infirmity, only to marry his new wife, Anne of Brittany, and promptly have children with her. Historians still argue whether these annulments were a cynical abuse of religious power or a necessary tool for maintaining political stability. The Church held immense power, and the ability to grant or deny an annulment gave it a great deal of leverage over the secular rulers of Europe. So, as you can see, your vows were meant to last a lifetime, and the only way out was to prove they were never valid to begin with. It was a system that valued the institution of marriage above the happiness of the individuals within it. The idea of happily ever after was a secondary concern to the legal and political realities of the day. The annulment was a complex and very expensive legal battle, A last resort for those with the power and money to wield it. For the average person, if the marriage didn't work out, you were simply stuck. And for better or worse, you had to find a way to make it work. As you reflect on the harsh realities of medieval annulments, a more pleasant thought comes to mind: the wedding feast. But what about the centerpiece of so many modern weddings? The tiered, sugary confection that is the wedding cake. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval wedding cake, as we know it today, didn't exist. Instead, you would have a rather different and far more precarious tradition. The guests would bring small, spiced buns or simple cakes and pile them into a large, precarious tower in the middle of the feasting table. The newlyweds, you and your new spouse, were then expected to kiss over the top of this unstable tower of cakes without knocking it over. A quirky tidbit is that if you succeeded, it was considered a sign of a prosperous and fruitful marriage. If you failed and the cakes came tumbling down, well, it wasn't a good omen, but it did provide an excuse for everyone to grab a piece of the sweet treat. It's a bit like a medieval Jenga game, but with much higher stakes and a lot more crumbs. This tradition, with its layers and its symbolism of building a new life together, is the ancestor of our modern tiered wedding cake. The more successful the couple was at balancing the cakes, the more they were seen as being in sync. The cakes themselves were often made with honey, nuts, and spices. As sugar was an expensive and rare commodity, they were not the light, fluffy cakes of today, but dense, bread-like confections. The act of stacking them was a communal effort, with each guest contributing their own baked good, a physical representation of the community's support for the new couple. It was a shared experience, and a very public one. Historians still argue whether this was a true symbol of community support or a form of social pressure, a way to ensure that everyone brought a gift and participated in the wedding. It was likely a bit of both. It was a tangible way for everyone, from the wealthiest lord to the humblest peasant, to contribute to the new household. So, while you might not have a grand, white cake to slice into, you have this delightful, nervous game of balance. You lean in, trying to find the perfect angle, the perfect balance, to share a quick kiss with your spouse. The scent of cinnamon and honey fills your nose, and you can feel the warmth of the candles flickering around you. You are in the center of the room, all eyes on you, and for a moment, the world shrinks to just you, your spouse, and a very wobbly tower of buns. It's a beautifully simple tradition, and, in its own way, it's far more charming and personal than the impersonal grandeur of a modern cake. It's a moment of shared vulnerability and a sweet promise of a future built together. The cake tower has been successfully navigated, and you've shared a quick, honey-sweet kiss with your new spouse. The moment of levity passes, and the feast continues. Now, we turn our attention from the grand displays to the more intimate, but no less important, aspect of the wedding: the gifts. In a world with no gift registries or Amazon wish lists, what do you, a young married couple, receive from your guests? A mainstream historical fact is that wedding gifts in the Middle Ages were almost entirely practical. There were no decorative vases or crystal flutes. The gifts were things you needed to survive. They were items that would help you start your new household and contribute to your family's prosperity. You might find yourself unwrapping a new iron pot for the hearth, a pair of wooden spoons, or a sturdy wool blanket. These are not exciting gifts, but they are essential. A quirky tidbit is that gifts of iron and salt were particularly prized. Iron was a rare and valuable commodity, and an iron pot was a gift that would last a lifetime and be passed down through generations. Salt, too, was a precious resource, used for preserving food and as a flavoring. A bag of salt was not just a gift, it was a promise of a future without hunger. It's a reminder that in this world, survival was a daily struggle, and gifts were a tangible sign of support, a way to ensure that the new household had the tools it needed to thrive. Historians still argue whether the giving of practical gifts was a reflection of a society that valued utility over luxury, or if it was a form of communal insurance, a way for the community to invest in its own stability. It was likely a bit of both. The gifts were not just for you, they were for the good of the entire family, and, by extension, the community. The more prosperous your family became, the more you could contribute to the well-being of the larger group. You can see your new aunt and uncle proudly presenting you with a small, but heavy, iron kettle. It's a quiet moment, a simple gesture of love and support that says, "We are here for you. We want you to succeed." As you look at the pile of gifts, a few chickens, a sack of grain, a new spindle for spinning wool, you realize that they are more than just objects. They are a collection of hopes and good wishes, a tangible symbol of the community's investment in your future. It's a very different kind of love than the romantic one we know, but it is a love nonetheless. It's a love that is rooted in the earth, in the daily work, and in the quiet. Shared hope for a good life. It's a love that is forged in iron and preserved with salt. And as you prepare for the next step, you feel a small sense of gratitude for these practical, loving gestures. The feasting is done. The practical gifts are received. And you are officially a new couple, so far. We've explored weddings of the nobility and the common folk. Now, let's zoom out from the local manor and into the grand halls of power, where the stakes are so high they can change the course of history. We're talking about royal wedding extravagance. A mainstream historical fact is that royal weddings were not just family affairs, they were international events. A crucial form of diplomacy. A princess was often a living peace treaty, a human pledge of alliance between two rival kingdoms. Imagine for a moment that you are a foreign princess, a child of 10 or 12, sent across the seas to a new country and a new language to marry a prince you have never met. Your wedding is not a celebration of love, it is the solidification of a strategic alliance. The ceremonies were mind-boggling in their opulence, designed to impress and intimidate foreign dignitaries. A quirky tidbit is that these weddings often involved a proxy marriage first, where a stand-in would marry the bride in her home country before she was sent to her new kingdom. This allowed her to travel as a married woman, providing some measure of protection and respect. A proxy marriage was a legally binding contract, a physical promise that the deal was done. Historians still argue whether the extreme pomp and expense of royal weddings were a true reflection of the power of the monarchs or a desperate attempt to project an image of power they might not actually possess. It was likely a bit of both. The parades, the jousts, the multi-day feasts, the endless stream of musicians and performers. All of it was a very expensive performance designed to awe both the internal populace and foreign rivals. These were not just parties, they were political statements writ large. You might see a jousting tournament in honor of the wedding, with knights from both kingdoms competing. The winner would be a symbol of the strength of the new alliance. You are a pawn. Yes, but you are a very valuable pawn. Your marriage is the subject of countless negotiations and years of planning. The jewels you wear, the silks you are draped in, the procession of people and animals, all of it is a message. It says, "We are rich, we are powerful, and we have a new friend." Your personal feelings are irrelevant. The fate of two nations rests on your shoulders, and you must smile and wave, a living symbol of a political contract. It's a heavy burden, but for the rest of your life, you are a queen, a diplomat, and a walking, breathing symbol of peace. It's a gilded cage, but the cage is made of gold and the view from inside is spectacular. Having journeyed through the solemnities of the church, the boisterousness of the feast, and the staggering opulence of royal ceremonies, let's travel a bit further north, to a different kind of wedding. We're leaving the world of medieval Europe and sailing into the land of the Norse. We're talking about Viking nuptials. A mainstream historical fact is that Viking marriages were less about religious rites and more about legal contracts and family honor. There was no priest, no church, and no public declaration to God. The wedding was a bond between two families, meant to solidify a bloodline and forge a powerful alliance. The ceremony itself was often less about a single day of celebration and more about a series of rituals leading up to the union. A quirky tidbit is that the wedding often involved a mock battle or a trial by combat. The groom, accompanied by his friends, would abduct the bride from her family. This was not a true abduction, but a ritualized demonstration of the groom's strength and worthiness to protect his future wife. The bride's family, in turn, would put up a symbolic fight, showing their own strength and that their daughter was a prize worth fighting for. It was a physical and symbolic negotiation, a show of force that was meant to impress the other family and the wider community. Historians still argue whether these rituals were a true reflection of the brutality of Viking society or if they were a deeply symbolic way of showing honor and strength. It was likely a bit of both. The Vikings were a pragmatic people, and their marriages were an extension of their social and legal codes. The wedding was a legal contract, a binding agreement that was witnessed and affirmed by the community. A wedding feast was held, and the couple would exchange gifts, often practical items like weapons, tools, or land. The bride, in particular, would be given a sword or a ring, a symbol of her new status as a wife and a partner. You can almost feel the cold Scandinavian air, the smell of wood smoke and the sea. The wedding hall is a longhouse, filled with the loud chatter of family and friends, the clatter of tankards, and the warmth of a central fire. The wedding is not just a party, it's a display of strength, a test of character, and a binding agreement that will last a lifetime. The bride is not just a delicate flower, she is a warrior in her own right, a partner who will help her husband run the household, raise the children, and protect the family. It's a very different kind of wedding, and in its own way, it's far more honest. It's a union not of two souls, but of two strengths, a pledge of mutual support in a very hard world. Having journeyed from the boisterous feasts of medieval Europe to the stark, practical rituals of the Vikings, let's turn our gaze to a different empire entirely. We're crossing the sea and land to the heart of what was once the Roman Empire, but now, a new and different world, the Byzantine Empire. We are talking about the Byzantine bridal chamber and the incredibly ritualized and symbolic marriage customs of this ancient civilization. A mainstream historical fact is that Byzantine marriage was a public and religious rite, but its core was built on a series of solemn and complex rituals that took place over a period of days. The ceremony wasn't just in a church, it was a multi-stage process that involved a betrothal ceremony, a solemn wedding service, and finally, the bedding ceremony, which was just as public as its Western counterpart, but with its own unique flavor. A quirky tidbit is that the bride would be crowned with a circlet of gold or flowers, and the groom would be crowned as well. This act of crowning was one of the most important parts of the wedding ceremony, symbolizing their new status as the king and queen of their own household, a microcosm of the divine kingdom. The crowns were a symbol of both their new royalty and their martyrdom for the sake of their new family. It's a heavy concept, isn't it? The idea that your marriage is a kind of sacrifice, a sacred martyrdom for the sake of your family and your faith. The bridal chamber itself was a place of deep symbolism. The bed was blessed, the room was cleansed, and the couple was prepared for their new life together. The bedding ceremony was less about public revelry and more about a solemn procession of family members who would escort the couple to their chamber and offer a blessing. Historians still argue whether the Byzantine rituals were a continuation of ancient Roman traditions, simply repackaged in a Christian context, or if they were a new and distinct form of ritualization. It's likely a bit of both, a blend of ancient traditions and new religious beliefs. The Byzantines were masters of ritual and symbolism, and their wedding ceremonies were a prime example of their ability to infuse every action with a deeper, more profound meaning. As you imagine yourself in a silk tunic, a golden circlet on your head, you can feel the weight of history on your shoulders. You are not just a bride, you are a living symbol of an ancient and powerful tradition. Your marriage is a sacred contract, not just between you and your husband, but between your families, your people, and your God. The scent of incense, the flickering light of 100 candles, and the solemn chanting of the priest all contribute to a feeling of deep, spiritual significance. It's a world away from the chaotic and rowdy feasts of the West, a quiet, almost meditative, journey into a new life. It's a very different kind of wedding, a much more sacred and solemn one. The solemn Byzantine rituals and the boisterous Viking feasts were shaped by their cultures, but every wedding, no matter the place or time, had a soundtrack. We're talking about the role of the minstrels and troubadours. A mainstream historical fact is that these traveling performers were more than just musicians. They were the storytellers, the newsbearers, and the cultural glue of the Middle Ages. They carried tales of valor, love, and tragedy from one castle to another, and at a wedding, their role was to provide the atmosphere and the narrative of the celebration. You can almost hear the soft notes of a lute mingling with the clatter of plates and the buzz of conversation. The music is not just a background hum, it's a living, breathing part of the event. A quirky tidbit is that troubadours, in particular, were often poets and composers who specialized in courtly love, a highly idealized and often non-physical form of romance between a knight and a married noblewoman. While this kind of love was rarely seen in the real-world marriages of the time, the songs themselves provided a romantic backdrop for the wedding, a beautiful contradiction to the very pragmatic nature of the union. It's a bit like a medieval wedding playlist, but the DJ is a guy with a funny hat and a lifetime of stories. Historians still argue whether the romantic ideals sung by the troubadours had any real impact on the way people viewed marriage, or if it was just a form of escapism, a fantasy world that allowed people to dream of a love they couldn't have. It was likely a bit of both. The songs provided a sense of romance and grandeur to the marriage, elevating it from a simple business deal to something more meaningful. The minstrels and troubadours were the masters of ceremony, the keepers of the rhythm of the day. They would play a lively dance tune to get everyone on their feet, a solemn ballad during the feast, and perhaps a bawdy song during the bedding ceremony. You find yourself humming along to a tune, the words unfamiliar, but the melody deeply comforting. The performers are not just there to entertain, they are there to create a feeling, a sense of shared joy and celebration. They are the masters of the moment, shaping the energy of the room with a flick of a wrist or a change of a note. The wedding is a performance, and the minstrels and troubadours are the stars. Their presence reminds you that even in a world of harsh realities and practical concerns, there is still room for beauty, for poetry, and for a good story. And what is a wedding, after all, if not the beginning of a new story? The minstrels have set the scene with their songs, but one small, circular object on your finger carries more history than all of their ballads combined. We're talking about rings and their ancient symbolic roots. A mainstream historical fact is that the tradition of giving a ring as a sign of marriage stretches back not just to the Middle Ages, but to the ancient Romans and even further. The circular shape of the ring, with no beginning and no end, has long symbolized eternal love and commitment. But it wasn't always a symbol of romance. The first rings were often made of iron, not gold or silver, and they were a symbol of a contract, a physical bond to seal an agreement. A quirky tidbit is that the Romans would sometimes give an iron ring attached to a small key, symbolizing the wife's authority and control over the household goods. The ring was not a symbol of affection, but a very practical sign of her new legal and social status. It was the key to the castle, so to speak. During the Middle Ages, the ring became more a part of the wedding ceremony itself, often a simple gold or silver band, and the fourth finger of the left hand was chosen because of a belief in the vena amoris, the vein of love, which supposedly ran directly from that finger to the heart. Historians still argue whether the Church's adoption of the ring in the marriage ceremony was a co-opting of a pagan tradition, or if it was a genuine attempt to infuse a secular object with a new, sacred meaning. It was likely a bit of both, a way for the Church to bring a popular custom under its control and give it a new, Christian significance. The ring became a symbol not just of a contract, but of a sacred vow, a promise made before God. You can feel the cool metal against your skin, a silent promise. This small object, with its ancient history, is a physical anchor for all the vows you have made, a constant reminder of your new life. It's a very different kind of object from the diamond-encrusted rings of today. It's not about flash or expense, it's about the deep, unbroken circle of a promise. It's a weight on your finger, a symbol of a contract, and a silent, beautiful vow. It's a very simple and very profound gesture, and in its own way, it's one of the most powerful symbols of the entire wedding ceremony. The ring is a history lesson, a legal document, and a love story, all in a single, perfectly formed circle. The ring on your finger is a quiet promise. But what happens when promises are broken? In the Middle Ages, disputes between families or individuals could be settled in many different ways, some of them a little more dramatic than a lawyer's letter. We're talking about the wager of battle and dispute resolution. A mainstream historical fact is that trial by combat, or the wager of battle, was a legitimate legal procedure in many parts of medieval Europe. If two parties couldn't agree on a matter, they could literally fight it out to determine the truth. The winner was considered to be in the right, as it was believed God would grant victory to the just party. Now, imagine this applied to a marriage. A quirky tidbit is that while it was rare, a man could challenge another man to a duel over a marriage dispute. For instance, if a man felt his honor had been impugned by a marriage contract being broken, or if his wife's chastity was in question, he could resort to this very physical form of justice. The fight wasn't always a bloody, no-holds-barred brawl. It was often a highly ritualized affair with specific rules. And it could be fought with swords, clubs, or even a shield. The goal was often to force a surrender, not to kill. Historians still argue whether the wager of battle was a true reflection of a primitive legal system, or if it was a sophisticated form of conflict resolution that valued physical courage and honor. It was likely a bit of both. It was a way to settle a dispute when there was no clear evidence, a sort of legal coin toss with a lot more physical risk. As you consider the possibility, a slightly ridiculous, funny image comes to mind. Two men in a field, with a priest watching, all because someone forgot to add a clause about a certain parcel of land to a dowry agreement. It's a very different world from the polite arguments of a modern courtroom. It's a world where a handshake could lead to a sword fight, and a broken vow could be settled with a club. The idea that a marriage dispute could be resolved by a duel is a shocking reminder of how different the world was, and how deeply ingrained the concept of honor was in every aspect of life, even the most private. The idea of a duel to settle a marriage dispute is certainly dramatic, but for most people, the concerns were a little more grounded in daily life. A wedding was a time of high emotion and high stakes, and in a world where fate and fortune were often a matter of chance, people looked for signs and symbols everywhere. This brings us to a topic that touches almost every culture and every part of life: unlucky omens and superstitions. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval people, from the highest noble to the lowest peasant, were deeply superstitious. They believed that good and bad luck could be found in everything, and a wedding, the start of a new life, was a prime target for both. Imagine yourself as the bride on your wedding day. You're trying to put on your shoe, and it slips and falls. It's not just a clumsy moment, it's a potential omen of a difficult marriage. A quirky tidbit is that it was considered extremely bad luck for the bride to trip or stumble on her way to the church. To prevent this, the bride was sometimes carried over the threshold of her new home by the groom, a tradition that has survived to this day, though most people don't know its origins. The superstition was that a trip on the way in would bring evil spirits into the house, and carrying the bride was a way to prevent that. It's a bit like a medieval burglar alarm, but for ghosts. Historians still argue whether these superstitions were a form of religious belief, a way to explain the unexplainable, or if they were a form of social control, a way to enforce certain behaviors and traditions. It was likely a bit of both. Superstitions provided a sense of control in a world that was often chaotic and unpredictable. If something bad happened, at least you had a reason for it, a way to explain the inexplicable. You might find a four-leaf clover, a sign of good luck, and a sense of relief washes over you. Or you might hear a raven's cry, a bad omen, and a small shiver of dread runs down your spine. The entire day is a minefield of potential good and bad luck. You are in a constant state of awareness, looking for signs, hoping for the best, and trying to avoid any misstep that could doom your future. The superstitions of a medieval wedding day are as varied as the people themselves. We've talked about the whole tripping over your own feet thing, but let's focus on one of the most visible symbols of the bride's attire: the bridal headdress. A mainstream historical fact is that the headdress wasn't just a pretty accessory, it was a powerful symbol of the bride's status and her transition from maidenhood to marriage. For noble women, this could be an incredibly elaborate and expensive piece: a crown of gold, a circlet of jewels, or a delicate net of pearls. A quirky tidbit is that the headdress was often a way to show off a family's wealth. The more intricate the embroidery, the more expensive the jewels, and the more delicate the work, the higher the family's status. For a wealthy bride, the headdress was her moment to shine, a final grand display of her family's prosperity before she became a part of her husband's family. It's a bit like a medieval version of a diamond tiara, but with much more religious and social symbolism attached. For commoners, the headdress was a much simpler affair, often a wreath of flowers or a simple linen coif. But it still held the same symbolic weight. It was a sign that she was a bride, a woman on the cusp of a new life. Historians still argue whether the elaborate headdresses were a form of conspicuous consumption, a way to show off wealth and status, or if they were a continuation of ancient pagan traditions that saw the head as the seat of the soul and a place of power. It was likely a bit of both, a blend of social display and ancient belief. The headdress was a public announcement, a visual cue to the entire community that a marriage was taking place. It was a physical symbol of the bride's journey, a transition from one life to another, and as you put on the heavy, beautiful headdress, you can feel the weight of all the traditions, all the hopes and expectations resting on your head. It's a crown of sorts, a symbol of your new status and your new responsibilities, and as you walk, you can't help but feel a little bit like royalty, even if you're just marrying the boy from the next village over. The headdress is a visual signal, a public marker of your new status. But there is another, more oral signal that announces a wedding to the entire world, something that has echoed through the centuries, wedding bells and the sound of joy. A mainstream historical fact is that church bells were a vital part of medieval life, marking the time, announcing births, and tolling for deaths. But at a wedding, their sound took on a new and joyful significance. The ringing of the bells wasn't just a sound, it was an announcement, a celebration, and a warding off of evil. The sound of bells was believed to have a powerful, protective quality. A quirky tidbit is that the ringing of the bells was meant to drive away evil spirits or mischievous fairies who might try to interfere with the marriage. It's a bit like a very loud, very public medieval air horn designed to scare off any supernatural party crashers. The more bells, and the louder they rang, the better the couple's luck would be. This is a very different kind of sound than the solemn tolling of a funeral bell. This is a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Historians still argue whether the ringing of the bells was a pagan tradition that was later co-opted by the church, or if it was a purely Christian ritual meant to celebrate a new union. It was likely a blend of both. The church, ever the master of incorporating popular traditions, gave the bells a new purpose. Turning a pagan ritual into a Christian celebration, you can feel the sound of the bells reverberating through the air, a physical vibration that you can feel in your chest. It's a sound that says, "A new life has begun, rejoice." The sound is both a public announcement and a private prayer, a joyful noise that promises a happy future. The bells have rung, the feasting is in full swing, and a new life is beginning. We've talked about noble marriages for power and peasant marriages for survival. But there was another class, rising in power and wealth, that used marriage in a very specific and very practical way. We are talking about marrying for trade, guild and merchant unions. A mainstream historical fact is that in the burgeoning towns and cities of the late Middle Ages, marriage was a powerful tool for business alliances. A merchant's daughter was not just a person, she was an asset, a living trade agreement. A quirky tidbit is that these marriages were often arranged to consolidate capital, expand trade routes, and secure a monopoly on a particular good. For example, a successful spice merchant might marry his daughter to the son of a textile trader, thus creating a powerful business that could control both markets. The dowry, which we talked about earlier, wasn't just land and goods, it could be cash, ships, or even shares in a trading venture. It was a merger and acquisition, medieval style. It's a very different kind of contract, one written not just on parchment, but in the goods and services that made up their lives. Historians still argue whether these marriages were more about profit than love, or if a form of affection could grow within such a pragmatic arrangement. It was likely a blend of both. A merchant's life was a precarious one, and a marriage was a way to mitigate risk and secure a future. You might find yourself in a large hall, not of a castle, but of a guild house, the air thick with the smell of leather and parchment. The wedding is less a feast and more a business meeting, with men in fine wool and fur coats talking about prices, markets, and future ventures. Your marriage is the subject of their conversation, not in a romantic sense, but in a very practical, very profitable one. It's a reminder that money, not just land or titles, was becoming a powerful force in the medieval world, and marriage was its primary tool. The merchant's marriage was a financial contract, but what about the smaller, more personal traditions that tied it all together? We're going to focus on a very specific, and often overlooked item from the bride's attire, the wedding handkerchief. A mainstream historical fact is that the handkerchief, often embroidered with symbols of love and fidelity, was a traditional gift from the bride to the groom. It wasn't just a piece of cloth, it was a physical token of her promise, a tangible symbol of her dowry and her loyalty. A quirky tidbit is that the handkerchief was sometimes used during the bedding ceremony, a final public act to show the consummation of the marriage. The handkerchief would be left in a prominent place to be found the next morning. A somewhat indelicate but very public proof of the marriage's validity. It's like a medieval version of a "we're married" announcement on social media, but with a lot more laundry. It was a very pragmatic and very public way to put any doubts to rest. Historians still argue whether this was a true and widespread tradition, or if it was more of a regional custom. The evidence is sparse, but the idea of a physical object being used as proof of a new life is a powerful one. You can almost feel the delicate linen of the handkerchief in your hand, a small square of fabric that holds a huge weight of meaning. It's a very quiet, very personal symbol in a day full of loud, public displays. It's a reminder that even in the most formal of ceremonies, there were still small, intimate moments that were just for the couple. The wedding handkerchief is a quiet token of a new beginning, but for noble weddings, the entertainment was anything but quiet. We're moving from the delicate to the downright dangerous. We are talking about jousts, tournaments, and wedding games. A mainstream historical fact is that for a noble or a royal wedding, the celebration wasn't just a feast, it was a martial spectacle designed to impress and entertain. The wedding was a perfect excuse to hold a tournament, bringing together knights from all over the kingdom to compete for honor and glory. You can almost feel the roar of the crowd, the thundering of hooves, and the splintering of lances. A quirky tidbit is that these tournaments were not just a show of skill, they were often highly theatrical events with elaborate ceremonies and a specific set of rules. The knights would ride with colourful pennants and heraldic crests, and they would be competing for prizes and the favour of the ladies. It's like a medieval version of the Super Bowl, but with more pointy sticks and a lot less padding. The winner of the tournament would often be given a prize by the bride herself, a symbolic gesture of her grace and her new power. Historians still argue whether these tournaments were a genuine form of martial training or if they were a way to blow off steam and express social tensions in a controlled environment. It was likely a bit of both. The tournament was a way for knights to practice their skills, to show their courage, and to compete for status, but it was also a way for the lords to display their power and to entertain their guests. The jousting and mock battles were a physical manifestation of the political alliances that were being forged by the marriage. The men were fighting for honor, and the families were fighting for power. As you sit in the viewing stands, the sun warm on your face, you can't help but feel a sense of both awe and terror. The line between sport and war is a very fine one, and you are watching it played out in front of you, a very dangerous game with a very high prize. The jousting tournament is a display of honor and a rather violent form of celebration. But what about when a marriage wasn't so much a political alliance or a simple contract, but something more forceful? We're talking about the strange case of the marriage by capture. A mainstream historical fact is that in some early medieval societies, and in some fringe cases in later period, the custom of abducting a bride was practiced. This wasn't a violent, random act, it was a ritualized form of marriage. The capture was often a mock abduction, a staged event meant to demonstrate the man's strength and the woman's desirability. It's a very different kind of romantic gesture, isn't it? A quirky tidbit is that in some cases, this mock abduction was a way to bypass a family's disapproval or to get around a dowry that was considered too high. It was a way for a man to essentially say, "I'm taking her whether you like it or not," but in a way that is still somewhat socially acceptable. It's a bit like a medieval elopement, but with a lot more shouting and a little bit of theatrical running. Historians still argue whether this practice was a true remnant of a more primitive or less organized society, or if it was a clever legal loophole for those who couldn't afford a proper wedding. It was likely a bit of both. A custom that survived in some remote areas and was used as a tool by those who didn't want to play by the rules. You can almost feel the tension in the air, the mix of fear and excitement as the capture unfolds. It's a high-stakes, dramatic ritual that says, "This marriage is happening, and it's going to be on my terms." It's a very different kind of beginning to a marriage, a raw and primal one. But for some, it was the only way. The marriage by capture was a dramatic, albeit rare, way to begin a marriage. But for the vast majority of people, The beginning was much more sedate and much less physical. It started long before the wedding day, often when you were just a child. We're talking about arranged marriages and childhood betrothals. A mainstream historical fact is that in noble families, it was not uncommon for children to be betrothed from infancy, or at least from a very young age. The contract was signed, the future was sealed, and the two families became allies long before the children involved were old enough to understand what was happening. Imagine a little girl of 5 or 6, or a boy of 7 or 8, learning that their future has been decided for them. A quirky tidbit is that in some cases, the child betrothal was so formal that a stand-in would hold a hand-fasting ceremony for the children, and the vows would be spoken on their behalf. This was a legal and social contract, a promise that could not be broken. It was a way for a family to secure a future alliance and to ensure their lineage would continue. Historians still argue whether this practice was a form of child abuse or a necessary, pragmatic tool for survival in a dangerous and uncertain world. It was likely a bit of both, for the parents. It was a way to ensure their children would be safe and provided for, but for the children, it meant a loss of autonomy and a future that was not their own. You can almost feel the weight of this decision. You are a child, but you are also a piece of a larger puzzle, a pawn in a game of politics and power. Your marriage is a cold, hard fact of your life, decided by your parents for reasons that you can only vaguely comprehend. It's a very different kind of beginning, a quiet, almost invisible one. There is no grand proposal, no tearful acceptance, just a simple announcement and a knowledge that your future is no longer your own. It is a long, slow journey toward a life that was chosen for you, and you must simply walk the path. The world of arranged marriages and childhood betrothals was a formal one, governed by contracts and family politics. But what about the heart that simply couldn't be bound by such agreements? What about those who decided to take matters into their own hands? This brings us to a wonderfully unconventional and very famous exception to the rules, the unconventional Gretna Green elopements. A mainstream historical fact is that in the 18th century, a legal loophole in England allowed people under the age of 21 to marry without parental consent, but only if they eloped to Scotland. The first village across the border, Gretna Green, became a haven for runaway lovers, a place where a blacksmith or a ferryman could perform a legally binding marriage with a simple exchange of vows. A quirky tidbit is that the village blacksmith became the unofficial priest of Gretna Green. He would perform the ceremony over his anvil, a symbol of the strength and permanence of the union he was forging. It's like a medieval version of a drive-through wedding, but with a lot more soot and a very large hammer. The practice became so popular that it was immortalized in popular culture, a symbol of true love conquering all. It was a romantic, albeit slightly rebellious, act that was a direct counterpoint to the pragmatic and political marriages we've been discussing. Historians still argue whether the Gretna Green elopements were a true revolution against the old ways, or if they were simply a safety valve for a society that was struggling to reconcile its old traditions with its new, more romantic ideals. It was likely a bit of both. It was a legal loophole that allowed a form of freedom that was otherwise unavailable, and it was a beacon of hope for those who wanted to marry for love, not for money or power. It's a reminder that even in the most rigid of systems, there are always cracks where a bit of romance can seep through. The Gretna Green elopements were a romantic rebellion against the rigid rules of medieval marriage, a sign that love could and would find a way. But even in the most romantic of unions, there were still ancient traditions at play, traditions that spoke a language all their own. We're talking about bridal flowers and their hidden language. A mainstream historical fact is that long before bouquets were about a perfect color palette, they were bundles of herbs and flowers chosen for their symbolic meaning and their protective properties. A quirky tidbit is that the herbs in a medieval bridal bouquet were often as important as the flowers. Garlic and dill were included to ward off evil spirits and bad luck, while rosemary was a symbol of remembrance and fidelity. The flowers themselves had their own secret meanings. Myrtle was for love and marriage, and orange blossoms, a favorite of royalty, symbolized purity and chastity. It was a language of plants, a silent communication between the bride and her guests, a botanical code that everyone understood. It's like a medieval version of a cryptic text message, but with a much better scent. Historians still argue whether the symbolism of the flowers was a continuation of ancient pagan beliefs in the power of nature, or if it was a purely Christian tradition that saw flowers as a symbol of God's grace and creation. It was likely a blend of both, a beautiful fusion of old and new. The bouquet was more than just a decoration, it was a physical prayer, a wish for a happy and prosperous future. You can almost feel the fresh scent of the herbs and flowers as you walk down the aisle. Each flower, each leaf, is a whisper of a promise, a wish for a life filled with love, fidelity, and a little bit of magic. And in a world where so much was left to fate, a little magic was a very welcome thing. The language of flowers and herbs speaks of ancient beliefs and new hopes. But what happens after the wedding day, when the feast is over and the guests have gone home? What comes next for the new couple? For many, it was a practical matter of settling into a new routine, but for the wealthy, there was a tradition that was the culmination of the entire wedding ritual. We're talking about the history of the honeymoon ritual. A mainstream historical fact is that the word honeymoon has a very literal and very surprising origin. It's not about a romantic trip to a faraway land. It's about a period of time after the wedding when the couple would drink a fermented honey-based drink called mead. A quirky tidbit is that the mead was believed to have aphrodisiac qualities and was meant to help the couple conceive a child. The moon part of the word referred to the lunar cycle, or the period of a month, and the belief was that by drinking the mead for a full moon cycle, the couple would increase their chances of a fruitful union. It's like a medieval version of a fertility ritual, but with a much better drink. It's a very different kind of honeymoon, one that is focused on a very practical goal, the continuation of the family line. Historians still argue whether this was a true and widespread tradition or if it was a more isolated custom. It was likely a custom that was more common in Northern European cultures, where mead was a popular drink. But the idea of a period of time after the wedding, a time for the couple to be alone and to focus on their new life, is a universal one. So, as you and your new spouse sit by the fire, you're not planning a trip to the coast, you're drinking a sweet alcoholic beverage, hoping for a baby, and you're calling it a honeymoon. It's a reminder that even the most romantic-sounding words have a very practical, and sometimes very funny, origin. The mead-soaked honeymoon has concluded, and you're now settling into your new life. But you weren't alone on your wedding day. You were surrounded by a party of friends and family, all of whom had a very specific role to play. We're talking about the role of the best man and bridesmaids. A mainstream historical fact is that these roles have a much more pragmatic and less glamorous origin than their modern counterparts. For the groom, the best man wasn't just a friend, he was a literal best man in a time of conflict. A quirky tidbit is that the best man was often the most skilled swordsman or the strongest fighter in the groom's inner circle. His job was to stand by the groom's side during the wedding ceremony, armed and ready, to defend against any rivals who might try to kidnap the bride or prevent the marriage. It's like a medieval security detail. But with a lot more swords and a lot less formality, it was a very serious and very dangerous role, a promise to protect the groom and the bride at all costs. For the bride, the bridesmaids had a very different role. They were not there just to help with the dress, they were there to act as decoys. A mainstream historical fact is that the bridesmaids would dress in similar gowns to the bride, confusing evil spirits or rival suitors who might try to abduct her. The bride was meant to blend in with her party, a clever form of spiritual camouflage. The more bridesmaids there were, the more protection the bride had. It's a very different kind of wedding party, one that is focused on survival, not just on looking good in photos. Historians still argue whether these traditions were a true reflection of the danger of the times, or if they were symbolic rituals that had lost their original meaning over time. It was likely a bit of both, a blend of ancient superstition and a very real sense of caution. The wedding party was a small army, a group of people who were there to protect and defend the new couple. It's a reminder that even in the most joyous of moments, there was still a sense of danger and a need for protection. Your friends were there not just to celebrate, but to stand guard. The bridesmaids and the best man were your security detail. But once the ceremony was over, a different kind of ritual began, one that was a bit less formal and a lot more rowdy. We're talking about the curious case of the stolen bride's garter. A mainstream historical fact is that this wasn't just a simple toss, it was a frenzied and often chaotic tradition. After the bedding ceremony, the guests, particularly the men, would rush into the bedroom to try and steal a piece of the bride's clothing, usually her garter or a ribbon from her dress. It was considered a symbol of good luck and a way to absorb some of the couple's good fortune and fertility. A quirky tidbit is that the act of stealing the garter was often a mad scramble, with men fighting and pushing to get a piece of the fabric. The bride, perhaps a little flustered, was expected to laugh it off, and the garter was seen as a prize. Sometimes, the groom would throw the garter to the crowd, hoping to appease them and to get a little bit of privacy. It's like a medieval version of a mosh pit, but the prize is a piece of hosiery. Historians still argue whether this was a true fertility ritual or if it was a social ritual to let off steam and to make the bedding ceremony less awkward. It was likely a bit of both, a mix of ancient superstition and a modern desire to make things a little less uncomfortable. You can almost feel the chaos, the laughter, and the sense of release as the guests finally get their prize. It's a very different kind of celebration, a physical and public one, a testament to the fact that in the Middle Ages nothing was truly private. The garter toss was a chaotic scene, but it was just one of many traditions that had a much deeper history. We're moving from the rowdy to the reverent as we explore the pagan echoes in medieval Christian weddings. A mainstream historical fact is that the Church, in its long history of converting pagan populations, often absorbed and repurposed ancient traditions into its own ceremonies. The wedding ceremony was no different, a beautiful fusion of old beliefs and new ones. A quirky tidbit is that the custom of a bride carrying a bouquet of flowers and herbs, which we discussed earlier, has its roots in pagan fertility rites and a belief that the scents would ward off evil spirits. The bridal veil, too, was a pagan tradition meant to conceal the bride from evil spirits who might try to steal her. It's like a spiritual invisibility cloak. The Church didn't erase these traditions, it simply gave them a new, Christian meaning. The bouquet became a symbol of purity, and the veil became a symbol of modesty and devotion. Historians still argue whether this was a cynical move by the Church to gain converts or a genuine effort to make the faith more accessible to a people who were deeply connected to their ancient customs. It was likely a bit of both. The Church was a master of marketing, and it understood that a new religion would be more easily adopted if it felt familiar. The wedding ceremony, in particular, was a canvas for this blend of old and new. You can almost feel the ancient spirits, the old gods of the forest and the fields, standing in the shadows of the church, their customs alive and well in the new ceremony. It's a reminder that history is not a clean, linear path. It's a messy, beautiful tapestry of old and new. And you are a part of it. The pagan echoes linger in the background, a whisper of a forgotten past. But let's return to the spectacle, the glorious, over-the-top display of wealth that was a noble wedding feast. We've talked about the food, but let's dive deeper into the sumptuousness of wedding feasting. A mainstream historical fact is that the feasts of the elite were not just meals, they were multi-course banquets that could last for days. A parade of food designed to impress and to showcase the family's prosperity. A quirky tidbit is that the food was often presented in a highly theatrical manner. Courses would be announced with the sound of trumpets, and the dishes themselves would be a work of art. The subtleties we mentioned earlier were just one part of it. There would be dishes with names like cockatrice, a fake creature made from a roasted chicken sewn onto a pig, or a boar's head presented with a whole roasted apple in its mouth. The more exotic the animal, the more extravagant the dish, and the more praise the host would receive. It's like a medieval version of a food truck festival. But every food truck is trying to one-up the others with a slightly terrifying centerpiece. Historians still argue whether the extreme lavishness of these feasts was a genuine reflection of a noble family's wealth, or if it was a form of conspicuous consumption, a way to spend money for the sole purpose of showing off. It was likely a bit of both. The feast was a political statement, a public demonstration of a family's power and a way to cement their place in the social hierarchy. It was a physical promise that the new couple would not want for anything. As you sit at the high table, you are not just eating, you are participating in a very expensive, very public performance. The wedding feast was a symbol of a family's power, but the marriage itself was often the single most important tool in that family's arsenal. We're moving from the feast to the political realities behind it. We're talking about marrying for political alliances and treaties. A mainstream historical fact is that in medieval Europe, a royal marriage was the primary way to forge a new alliance, to solidify a peace treaty, or to combine two kingdoms into one. A queen was not just a person, she was a living, breathing legal document, a physical embodiment of a contract between two nations. A quirky tidbit is that these marriages were often so critical that they were negotiated for years, with diplomats and spies travelling between kingdoms to work out the smallest details. The age of the bride and groom, the dowry, and the terms of succession were all part of a very complex, very high-stakes game of chess. The marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Louis VII of France, for instance, brought a huge amount of land to the French crown. When she later divorced him and married Henry II of England, she brought that same land to the English crown, a political masterstroke that would shape the course of history for centuries. Her marriage was a direct cause of war, a symbol of the immense power of a woman, not as a ruler, but as a piece of a political game. Historians still argue whether these marriages were a cynical manipulation of people for political gain or a necessary tool for survival in a world of constant conflict. It was likely a bit of both. In a world where war was the norm, a marriage was a way to secure a fragile peace, a temporary truce that could last for a generation or more. You can almost feel the weight of this responsibility. You are not just marrying a person, you are marrying a country. Your love life, your children, and your very existence are all part of a larger, more complex political narrative. The vows you speak are not just to your spouse, they are to a nation. And in a strange way, that is the most powerful and most terrifying kind of commitment there is. We've explored the grand spectacle of a royal marriage, where a person becomes a political treaty, a living symbol of peace. But what about the women who never got to be a living treaty, who never married at all? We're talking about the unseen lives of medieval spinsters. A mainstream historical fact is that in an era where a woman's value was often tied to her marriage and her ability to produce heirs, an unmarried woman faced a life of social and economic precariousness. There was no real social safety net, and without a husband or a family to provide for her, a woman was in a very difficult position. A quirky tidbit is that the word spinster literally meant a woman who spun thread. It was a term for an unmarried woman who earned her living by spinning wool or flax into thread, a common trade that allowed a woman to be financially independent, but it also became a label for a woman who was left on the shelf. It's a bit like a medieval insult, one that says, "You're still single, and here's a word for it." It was a life of hard work and often social isolation, a contrast to the supposed glamour of a married life. Historians still argue whether the life of a spinster was a choice or a consequence of social and economic realities. For some women, it was a choice, a way to live an independent life. But for many others, it was a necessity, a path they were forced to take because they couldn't find a suitable husband or didn't have a dowry to secure a marriage. You can almost feel the quiet solitude of a woman spinning thread by the fire, her life a world away from the feasts and the jousts. Her story is not a grand, romantic one, but it is a story of resilience and survival, a testament to the fact that a woman could, and did, find a way to make a life for herself outside of marriage. Her life was a quiet, almost invisible one, but it was a life nonetheless, and a reminder that not all stories end with a wedding. The lives of spinsters offer a quiet counterpoint to the boisterous spectacle of a noble wedding. We've seen how marriage was a political tool for the elite, but for the common peasant, it was a very different kind of transaction. We're talking about the economics of a peasant wedding. A mainstream historical fact is that a peasant wedding was not just a celebration, it was a carefully considered economic decision. A way for a new couple to pool their meager resources and start a life together. There was no dowry in the noble sense, but there was a mourning gift, a small sum of money or a piece of land given by the groom's family to the bride. A quirky tidbit is that the mourning gift was often a physical representation of the groom's ability to provide for his new family. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough to buy a few chickens, a plough, or a small piece of land. It was a very practical gift, a way to show that the groom was a man of his word and that he would be a good provider. It's a very different kind of contract, one written in hard work and small coin. Historians still argue whether the peasant wedding was a true reflection of love or a cold, hard economic necessity. It was likely a blend of both. A peasant's life was a brutal and difficult one, and a marriage was a way to make that life a little bit easier. Two people working together could achieve more than one person working alone. The wedding was a moment of hope, a small celebration of a new partnership that would face the world together. The wedding was a quiet, almost invisible event in the grand scheme of things, but for the two people involved, it was the start of everything. The peasant wedding was a private affair, a quiet promise between two people, but a promise made in private is easily broken. And in the Middle Ages, the community needed to know that a marriage was legitimate. This brings us to the role of the wedding banns. A mainstream historical fact is that a ban, from the Old English word for summons or proclamation, was a public announcement of an upcoming marriage for 3 consecutive weeks before the wedding. The priest would announce the couple's intention to marry during a public church service. It was a way to prevent clandestine or secret marriages and to give anyone with a legal reason to object a chance to come forward. A quirky tidbit is that the bans were meant to prevent marriages between close relatives, people who were already married, or those who had some other legal impediment. It was a very practical form of public notice, a sort of medieval legal check. It's like a public database for marriage intentions, but instead of a computer, it was a very loud priest. The bans were a way to ensure the marriage was valid in the eyes of the church and the law. Historians still argue whether the bans were a true measure of social control or a necessary tool for maintaining a stable social order. It was likely a bit of both. It was a way for the church to ensure that all marriages were legitimate, and it was a way for the community to ensure that a new couple was starting their life on a solid legal footing. The public announcement was a formal acknowledgement of a new life, a new family, and a new contribution to the community. The public announcement of the bans was a way to make a private intention a public fact, and in that public space, there was one item of the bride's attire that held immense symbolic power: the bridal veil. A mainstream historical fact is that the bridal veil, which we often see as a symbol of innocence and purity, has a much older and more complex history. Its origins can be traced back to ancient Greece and Rome, where brides wore veils to conceal themselves from evil spirits. The veil was a form of protection, a way to confuse and ward off any malevolent forces that might try to steal the bride's happiness. A quirky tidbit is that in some traditions, the veil was not just a symbol of protection, it was also a symbol of modesty. In ancient Rome, the veil was a large, flame-coloured cloth called a flammeum that covered the bride's entire body, from head to toe. It was a sign of her new, reserved status as a married woman. It's a very different kind of veil from the delicate lace of today, one that is more about concealment than about beauty. Historians still argue whether the Church's adoption of the veil was a way to co-opt a pagan tradition, or if it was a genuine effort to create a new symbol of modesty and devotion. It was likely a blend of both. The Church took a symbol of protection and gave it a new, Christian meaning, turning it into a symbol of purity and the bride's submission to her husband. As you imagine yourself wearing the heavy, beautiful veil, you can feel the weight of centuries of tradition on your shoulders. It's a weight of protection, of modesty, and of a very old promise. The bridal veil has been lifted, and you are now officially a married woman. The solemnities are over, and the public feasting and revelry will soon come to an end. But for a royal couple, the wedding is just the beginning of a long and public performance. We're talking about the aftermath of a royal wedding. A mainstream historical fact is that the days and weeks following a royal wedding were a time of intense public scrutiny and choreographed events. The wedding was a feast for the eyes, but the aftermath was a crucial part of the political contract. A quirky tidbit is that the couple was often expected to make a series of public appearances, to travel through their new kingdom, and to meet with the people. It wasn't a honeymoon in the modern sense, it was a public relations tour. It was a way for the new queen to be introduced to her people, to be seen as a living, breathing part of the royal family, and to be presented as a symbol of the new alliance. It's like a medieval version of a press tour, but with a lot more horses and a lot less journalism. The public presentation of the new couple was a way to make the political reality of the marriage a social reality. Historians still argue whether the royal newlyweds tour was a genuine effort to connect with the populace or a cynical manipulation of public opinion. It was likely a bit of both. The people wanted to see their new queen, and the crown needed to ensure that the populace accepted her. The tour was a way to build a personal connection, to turn a political contract into a human one. As you ride through the streets, the crowds cheering, you feel a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Your private life is now public property, but in a strange way, that public life is the very thing that gives your marriage its purpose. The royal tour is a new kind of wedding tradition, one that is moving us closer to the modern world. But as we step out of the Middle Ages and into the early Renaissance, we find that many of the old beliefs, the superstitions and the rituals, have not disappeared. They have simply evolved. We're talking about wedding superstitions in the Renaissance. A mainstream historical fact is that the Renaissance was a time of great change, with new ideas in art, science, and philosophy. But the old fears and beliefs about luck, omens, and spirits still held a powerful grip on the popular imagination, especially when it came to a wedding. A quirky tidbit is that the custom of throwing rice or grain at the newlyweds, a symbol of fertility and prosperity, became even more popular in the Renaissance. The belief was that the more grain that was thrown, the more children the couple would have and the more prosperous their life would be. It's like a medieval version of a lottery, where the prize is a life of abundance. The tradition of a bride carrying something old, new, borrowed, and blue also has its roots in this era. A collection of talismans meant to ensure a happy marriage. Something old represented continuity with the past. Something new represented optimism for the future. Something borrowed represented borrowed happiness from a happily married friend. And something blue represented love and purity. It was a very practical and very beautiful set of superstitions, a way to ensure that you had all the good luck you could get. Historians still argue whether these superstitions were a sign of a society that was still clinging to its old beliefs or if they were a new, more refined form of a public ritual. It was likely a bit of both. The old traditions were simply repackaged for a new, more sophisticated audience. The wedding was still a time of high emotion and high stakes, and people still looked for signs and symbols everywhere. The Renaissance wedding was a beautiful blend of old and new, a tapestry of ancient fears and modern hopes, and you were a part of it. The Renaissance wedding was a blend of old and new, and as we drift through the centuries, we see that the old pagan beliefs never truly died. They simply went underground, becoming a part of the folk magic and the superstitions that people still cling to today. We're talking about the legacy of love charms and marriage spells. A mainstream historical fact is that in the Middle Ages and beyond, people often turned to folk magic, not just to find a partner, but to ensure a happy and fruitful marriage. These weren't grand rituals, they were small, personal acts of magic, a quiet form of prayer to the old gods and the new ones. A quirky tidbit is that a woman might bake a charm into a cake, or a man might carry a small pouch of herbs and stones, hoping to attract love or to ward off a rival. Love spells were often simple incantations, whispered words, and the use of natural ingredients like rose petals, lavender, and honey. It was a very intimate and very personal kind of magic, a way to take control of a fate that was otherwise out of your hands. Historians still argue whether these spells were a true form of magic or a simple form of psychological self-soothing, a way for people to feel a sense of control in a world that was often chaotic. It was likely a bit of both. The belief in magic was so widespread that the spells themselves had a powerful psychological effect, a way to give a person a sense of hope and a feeling that their desires were being heard. You can almost feel the quiet hum of a spell, a whispered wish for a happy life. It's a reminder that even in the most religious of societies, there was still a place for the old ways, for the old beliefs in the power of nature and the power of a single, well-placed word. It's a very different kind of love, one that is rooted in the earth and in the quiet, secret hopes of the heart. The love charms and spells were a quiet, personal way to influence fate. But as we move toward the present, we can see that many of the bizarre, beautiful, and practical traditions we've explored are still with us, albeit in a very different form. We're talking about the modern wedding's medieval DNA. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the most common wedding traditions we take for granted today have a direct link to the Middle Ages. The white wedding dress, for example, is a direct descendant of the lavish displays of wealth we saw in noble weddings. The bride wore her best dress, and for Queen Victoria, her best dress was white. A quirky tidbit is that the tiered wedding cake is a direct evolution of the precarious tower of buns that newlyweds had to kiss over. The tossing of the garter and the bouquet are a nod to the ancient traditions of scrambling for good luck and protecting the bride from evil spirits. Historians still argue whether the modern wedding is a true reflection of love or a commercialized, sanitized version of a more complex and meaningful past. It was likely a blend of both. We've taken the most beautiful parts of the old traditions and infused them with our modern ideals of romance and love. We've forgotten the political alliances, the economic realities, and the dark superstitions, and we've replaced them with a celebration of two people's love. The wedding is still a public ritual, a way for a community to come together and celebrate a new beginning, but the reasons for that celebration have changed. You can almost feel the threads of history running through the modern wedding, the quiet vows, the beautiful music, the gathering of friends and family. It's all there, a living, breathing history lesson. The modern wedding is a beautiful, romantic, and slightly nostalgic look at a past we can't quite remember, but whose traditions we still carry with us. It's a reminder that even in a world of online dating and pre-nuptial agreements, a part of us still yearns for the simple, powerful rituals of the past. The modern wedding is a beautiful, if sanitized, echo of a much stranger past. But now, as our journey comes to an end, it's time to leave the loud feasts, the solemn rituals, and the strange traditions behind. We have journeyed through a world where love was a side effect, not a prerequisite, where a marriage was a political contract, not a romantic ideal, and where a wedding was a public performance, not a private moment. You have been a nobleman, a peasant, a merchant, and a princess. You have seen a world that is both familiar and alien, and you have, hopefully, found a new way to see the simple act of two people coming together. We've seen the marriage contract, where land and wealth were more important than love. We've explored the wedding procession, a public display of power and status. We've learned about the bridal ale, a practical way to start a new life with a little bit of cash, and we've touched on the bedding ceremony, a public ritual to ensure the marriage was valid. We've seen the echoes of pagan traditions in the bridal veil and the bouquet, and we've seen the roots of modern-day elopements in the Gretna Green blacksmiths. The history of a wedding is not a single, straight line. It's a messy, beautiful tapestry woven from threads of love, power, politics, and a little bit of magic. Now, as the last of the embers fades in the hearth, let's let the sounds of the past fade with it, the clatter of plates, the roar of the crowd, the thundering of hooves, and the singing of minstrels. Let it all soften into a distant hum. The history is written, the story is told, and the journey is complete. It's time to close your eyes, to let the silence of the night wash over you, and to let your mind drift. There is nothing more to do, nothing more to learn, and nowhere else to go. The past is safely in the past, and you are here, now, warm and safe in your bed. Just listen to the soft, rhythmic sound of your own breathing. Let it be your guide as you drift away. There is only peace and quiet now, and the gentle promise of sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.